Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on drug safety, innovation, and regulatory compliance with applied semantics and AI, hosted by Fluree and Vitality TechNet. In the next hour, we'll explore the case for semantic alignment of data within life sciences for better compliance outcomes. We have two excellent speakers for today's conversation, Eliud Polanco, president of Fluree, and Steve Hamby, senior semantic engineer at Vitality TechNet, and we'll get into their full bios in just a minute. Before we begin, I'll run through some brief housekeeping. Firstly, please feel free to use the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to them at the end of the call. Lastly, this call will be recorded and available for you and any of your colleagues to review after this webinar has concluded. Now, I'll introduce our two experts today who will be presenting. Steve Hamby joins us today from Vitality TechNet. Steve is a senior semantic engineer with more than 20 years of experience supporting semantic implementations at life sciences companies. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us today is Eliud Polanco, president of Fluree. Eliud has decades of experience as an enterprise data executive at large financial institutions, most recently as head of data innovation at Citibank and head of data and analytics at HSBC, Deutsche Bank, and Scotiabank. Eliud, thank you for joining.
Hey, Kevin, happy to be here.
With those introductions out of the way, we'll kick things off. Steve, you can take the wheel.
Thanks, Kevin. So advancing to the next slide, we see basically this slide describes the opportunity in the pharmaceutical industry to improve the performance of our pharmaceutical product portfolio. We'll address the lengthy time to develop and deliver pharmaceutical products to market, the cost to deliver those products, and the likelihood of success of a product in development. The pharmaceutical industry is known for its stringent regulations and challenging R&D landscapes, two key drivers that actually impact the industry R&D spending and present opportunities for improving product portfolio performance. An April 2021 report from the U.S. Congressional Budget Office highlighted the pharmaceutical industry as a leader in R&D intensity, that is, essentially the amount of revenue that is returned to R&D investment, with the pharmaceutical industry reinvesting on average approximately 25% of its revenue. This R&D investment is primarily focused on developing new pharmaceutical products to treat chronic diseases like cardiovascular diseases, cancers, etc., and then other conditions. The drug development process is often depicted as represented here, or I'm sorry, is often represented as 5 phases, as depicted in this chart with the yellow and pink pyramid. That object in the center. Phase 1 is typically labeled as discovery and development, with the purpose to identify and mature potential drug product candidates. For a specific therapeutic area, such as maybe oncology, we'll identify diseases of interest like myeloma, or understand, and we also need to understand the biological mechanisms of the disease, how the cancer forms, in this case, in plasma cells, multiplies, how the disease can damage bones, immune system, kidneys, etc. Intended drug targets for the disease or diseases that are selected. Basically, what will be the mechanism of action in the body, such that we'll be able to target that particular disease. Maybe, for example, in the case of myeloma, maybe we use CD38. That's a multifunctional protein with high expression for multiple myeloma. Limited expression on normal cells, so potential for high efficacy and low or safety as well. And that would make it potentially an attractive therapeutic target. You might also investigate modalities. There's going to be small molecule, a monoclonal antibody, etc. And then you'll need to screen multiple substances that are in your inventory that have been used for refining. Have been used for that particular drug target. You might also want to look at things like processes that have been used to refine the substance, and then other information that might be relevant to properly plan a drug development process to address that disease. Phase 1 also includes further developing substances selected to provide the best efficacy, safety, and quality. And according to a 2018 report from Tufts CSTD, that's a Center for the Study of Drug Development, Phase 1 can range from several months, but it's typically years, even 5 years or more. And it depends on things like the complexity of the disease that you're targeting, the research approach used, and then the maturity of the substances developed in terms of addressing that specific drug target. And then, of course, there's other environmental factors as well. Phase 2 is typically labeled preclinical research as we work our way up that pyramid there. And this, once you've identified drug candidates to identify or to address a particular drug target, to address a particular disease, then scientists use preclinical research to assess the safety and efficacy of the selected compounds in laboratory settings. And this phase involves in vitro or cell-based and in vivo animal-based testing to gather data on the compound's pharmacokinetics, that is movement in the body, how the drug moves in the body, toxicity, adverse effects at different doses, and the initial efficacy. And according to a 2018 Tufts CSDD study, the preclinical research typically takes several months to 3 years. Phase 2 typically culminates in submitting the investigational new drug application, or IND, to regulatory authorities like US FDA, European Medicines Agency, et cetera. And the process typically takes 6 to 12 months, moving up the drug development process one step higher. The phase 3, typically referred to as clinical research or clinical trials, involves 3 main stages, and apologize for the confusion here, but it's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There's also sometimes phase 4, et cetera, if deeper trials are required. And these are human clinical trials. Clinical phase 1 focuses on the safety and the dosage. Clinical phase 2 on efficacy and side effects. And then clinical phase 3, typically large-scale trials to confirm the efficacy and monitor adverse reactions. And a 2018 Tufts CSDD study, the same one I recorded a little bit a second ago, found that the average time spent in clinical research for drugs were 7.5 years, but timelines vary significantly based on drug product, the modality, as an example, the trial design, patient recruitment, regulatory interactions, and other factors. Following clinical research, unless some emergency use is authorized that would enable it to be done earlier, the company will submit a new drug application, a biologics licensing agreement, marketing authorization agreements, and other required submissions to regulatory authorities. That takes us into phase 4, regulatory review and approval, where regulatory agencies will review those submissions and decide whether to approve the drug for commercial use. This process involves rigorous assessment of the clinical data, the manufacturing processes, labeling. It can take 6 to 12 months, depending on the quality of the submission itself, regulatory communications and interactions, whether there's an emergency need or other factors. A 2021 study, and that's just, there's actually a stage 5 there as well. I'm going to skip that one. It's post-marketing surveillance for safety issues. And we're really focused on what it takes to get us from phase 1, drug discovery and development, to phase 4, regulatory approval. So a 2021 study from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, Informa Pharma Intelligence, and QLS Advisors, Quantitative Life Sciences, analyzed 9,700 drugs roughly from January 2011 to November 2020. According to that study, getting a new drug transition across those first 4 phases from drug discovery and development to regulatory approval takes an average of 10.5 years. The study also highlights that the therapeutic area selected or involved changes can range anywhere from 9.2 years to 12.2 years. For example, maybe oncology is going to have a longer, or drug candidates within an oncology therapeutic area are going to have a longer, take longer, have a higher average than other drugs. This study offered different average times at individual stages. For example, 2.3 years for phase 1, 3.6 years for phase 2, 3.3 years for phase 3, and 1.3 for regulatory approval. That said, if you kind of add it up, either way, it's coming out to roughly about 10.5 years for, on average, drug development. And that's from 2011 onward. And again, based on the dates of those studies. The drug development process is typically depicted as this pyramid, or really often as a funnel. And the idea is you've got tons of drug candidates at the very beginning when you're doing that initial screening and selecting substances or compounds. And then as you move up those drug phases, it becomes a smaller number. Maybe it's thousands at the beginning, hundreds once you get into preclinical research. You then further down select to maybe 10, or possibly just singles going into clinical trials. And then it's typically just 1 or 2 that's getting approved. The 2021 study found that a new drug candidate in phase 1 discovery and development had a 7.9% probability for success in receiving approval. So this represents this chart, and those numbers represent key factors in the timeline and the probability of success. These, I won't call them failures, but the lack of success drives up cost. So those are two key factors: long timelines, the amount of investment there, and then the low success rates. And while these costs, we've got 2.9 billion as a number there. While these costs differ depending on factors such as the modality, is it small molecule, large molecule, et cetera, targeted disease, the complexity of that disease, therapeutic area, et cetera. The 2016 study, this is a different Tufts CSDD study, said the average cost of a new medicinal drug from phase 1 discovery just through clinical trials is 2.6 billion, and then 2.9 billion getting it all the way through the phase 4 regulatory approval and marketing authorization. And of course, these costs actually include the failure, if you want to call it, of the other drugs. And it's really not failure. There's one drug that evolves out of here is the best in terms of efficacy, safety, quality. So the opportunity here is better data science to connect those relationships between my therapeutic area, the diseases, the targets, substances, the processes used, the analyses used, et cetera, such that we improve our investments in R&D to have shorter timelines, lower cost, and higher success rates. And we mentioned earlier that this is a 25% investment in R&D off of revenues. And so it's not necessarily looking to reduce that 25%. It's more about, can we now provide more drug therapies to address more diseases and treat more diseases. Next slide, improving pharmaceutical portfolio performance. And we're really referring back to the ROI here. This slide discusses the ROI in adopting a data science platform that would help us improve the pharmaceutical product portfolio performance. So recent achievements in the rapid development of the safe and effective COVID-19 vaccinations, where we were able to reduce the 10.5 years to literally months, and then these and other treatments for other high priority diseases have shown the ability for the pharmaceutical industry to optimize drug development processes. Although governmental R&D investment sharing and accelerated regulatory approvals are key to fast timeline for COVID vaccinations, two capabilities hold promise for future, specifically the ability to rapidly identify existing substances. So for example, in COVID-19, those companies that were given, or not all, but companies that were able to receive governmental grants or pre-purchase licenses for COVID-19 were able to show that they already had treatments for the severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, and that served as a foundation to be able to treat the COVID-19. The second repeatable lesson learned here is that companies must have an infrastructure that fosters collaboration with regulatory officials throughout the approval process, and really even possibly prior to. And the ROI for establishing this type of a platform it isn't necessarily the government grants and prepaid licenses for vaccinations that we saw with COVID-19, but it's increased revenue from a faster time to market. Drug discovery and development analyzes the top 50 pharmaceutical products every year in terms of global revenues. A majority of those products for the 2022 top 50 list were ones that were developed in the past 5 years. So there's a short span from being a brand new product brought to market to being a leader in sales. And the average monthly revenue for the top 50 drugs was $634.6 million US dollars per month. So assuming an information technology solution could reduce the 10.5-year average even just by a month, assuming the net present value of the total cost of ownership of that solution was less than 158.6 million US dollars, or 25% of that R&D, or I'm sorry, 25% of the revenue applied back to R&D, you would receive an ROI in just 1 month of revenue. Next slide. So this slide discusses our industry efforts driving data science platform adoption. There's definitely already pushes in this area. So the pharmaceutical industry is already engaged in many digital transformation initiatives, such as digital lab or lab digitization, and these have provided or have resulted in improved interoperability among pharmaceutical companies, regulators, other stakeholders, as well as improved development in general in pharmaceutical companies. But these digital initiatives pave the way for industry-wide semantic models that support this larger transformation that we're discussing here. Large-scale ontology development efforts such as the Allotrope Foundation ontology, the Soy Alliance's identification of medicinal products ontology. These are ontologies that have been developed across the industry using pre-competitive collaboration agreements, and they facilitate the establishment of this shared vocabulary. And that's what we attempt to depict here in the middle screen here, is that there's this shared vocabulary amongst companies. We're able to take disparate terms across many equipment manufacturers, across different labs, and then align these to some industry specific term. Not only does this help with our internal product developments, but when we're working with cross companies, possibly to develop vaccinations or other treatments, it allows us to be able to foster a better collaboration amongst those groups. Likewise, it allows us to foster better collaboration with the regulatories. And so pharmaceutical companies will incorporate these ontologies into their digital transformation initiatives to streamline laboratory operations, automate regulatory reporting, establish data fabrics that enhance drug discovery and development, as well as improve all phases of the drug development process. And as I stated earlier, the pharmaceutical industry is heavily regulated, and this is to ensure drug safety, efficacy, and quality. And this is just one factor in the lengthy timelines and the high cost of drug product development. In the very center here, this diagram, we're basically representing ECTD, or the Electronic Common Technical Document, as a standard format for submitting applications like NDAs, marketing authorizations, et cetera, as well as amendments, supplements, and reports to regulatory for most countries, including US FDA, EMA, the European Medicines Agency, UK MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, and many others. The ECTD consists of 5 modules. 2 of those sections are focused on what we call CMC, or chemicals, manufacturing, and control. And they align with these ongoing industry ontologies such as AFO and IDMP-O, excuse me, and that standard, that industry knowledge, but also then to feed back these reporting in at least 2 of the modules in the ECTD. For example, an IDMP-O concept about substance might, while it might also feed better drug discovery in phase 1, might also now align back to feed module 3, quality information about that particular substance. So some system that semantically aligns these ontologies, the various enterprise data sources across companies in the pharmaceutical industry, would foster collaboration within that company across multiple labs potentially, as well as partners in drug development, but also across regulatory. And this would potentially improve the cost, time, and success rate, and overall improve the pharmaceutical product portfolio performance. Such a solution requires trust, semantics, security, time as a first-class citizen, and discovery and accessibility. And we'll discuss these later. Eliud will in later slides. But by mapping the substance data using this semantic platform to IDMP-O, AFO, and other ontologies, we're able to better analyze the data, such as substances, the analyses, processes used, et cetera, and be able to extract lab data in its often company-specific terms, or now to industry terms. This enables scientists to better collaborate across labs, across partners, development partners, and regulatory. And as mentioned earlier, it aligns back to ECTD modules 2 and 3 specifically across CMC, and it improves regulatory communication. So this investment in industry ontology, coupled with the right semantic platform, is key in not only driving portfolio performance, but also this concept of a living ECTD could actually be used to drive or improve the process itself, meaning as we do drug discovery, look at substances. We can immediately feed module 3 information on quality. As we do analyses, additional quality information. As we do processes, execute processes, these are things that might lead back to module 2. But these living documents, then, we've seen how this has spurred innovation in improving product development in other industries. We believe this concept of living ECTD will have a similar effect in pharmaceutical development. Next slide. So this is actually a depiction. We mentioned 3 different ontologies earlier, and this is a depiction of one of those. It's this graphic is provided by the Pistoia Alliance, and it's a graphic that represents one set of concepts of why the IDMP-O is developed. You've got the concept of an ontology at the top and a concept of a data graph where you're mapping those ontology concepts to your actual data. And then from that, you're able to answer business questions. And so the IDMP-O is being developed. IDMP stands for Identification of Medicinal Products Ontology, IDMP-O. It's being developed as a project within the Pistoia Alliance, and it embodies the standards specified in ISO 11238 for substances and other related ISO standards. There's roughly 5 of them there. The ontology provides standard terminology for substances, pharmaceutical products, medicinal products, and it's based on knowledge management standards from the World Wide Web Consortium, which brought us basically the World Wide Web. It provides concepts for substances, as we see here. You've got the substance, you've got subclass single substance, subclass that of polymer substance, et cetera. And then relationships like the molecular structure of those. So it provides concept for substances. It includes class hierarchy, things like the moiety, molecular structure, related concepts. It also provides relationships from the substance to things like pharmaceutical ingredients. Pharmaceutical products in terms of pharmaceutical ingredients, which enable scientists to then ask questions like, what substances have a common moiety? What substances are used in, what products contain some specific substance? This helps us better understand substances that might address a specific disease or drug target when we're in drug discovery and development. But it also then helps us answer additional quality information in regulatory reporting. Coupling this with other ontologies, so now I think IDMP-O is just covering substances, pharmaceutical products, and medicinal products, but now attach it to things like the analyses of those substances in phase 2, as an example, or even possibly phase 3. You're able to now take in AFO, Allotrope Foundation Ontology, as an example. And this enables additional data science competency questions, such as what substances are used in what processes, what analyses have been used against this specific substance, what were metrics such as stabilization across different permutations or precursors to that particular substance. This information not only improves the pharmaceutical product development process, but also improves regulatory communications. Next slide. And by mapping these ontologies to our enterprise data sources, the semantic platform enables this, what we call an authoritative source of truth. And this comes from disparate authoritative systems of record across the enterprise. So this authoritative sources of systems of record are the things that we already have today, like our laboratory LIMS systems, laboratory information management systems, things of this nature, where these are authoritative records for a particular IT process or IT function. And by that, I mean some system that helps scientists do what they do. And so these authoritative systems of record are things that we typically don't challenge. They may have inaccurate or data quality issues, as we highlight some of these in this slide here, but we don't typically challenge them because they are a result of some processes performed. But the problem that we see is you can actually have data quality issues, such as inconsistent data across multiple sources, and sometimes, and this is often the case, over time. It's not that the information is wrong, it's that we recorded some, let's say, stabilization factor, measured it at some point in time. That's an accurate measurement. We then do some modifications to that substance, and we do another stabilization recording from an analysis, and we get a different result. Sometimes putting those together without proper description of that could lead to an inconsistent data across multiple sources over time. So the idea of the authoritative source of truth is to bring that together over some timeline that then properly depicts why there's inconsistent data there and be able to tell that story. So that's what we mean by an authoritative source of truth. Is it's linking all of this information over time, where it could be inconsistent at different collections, but over time it becomes a consistent story and resolves that one data quality. The second issue here is simply inaccurate data. And so one of the ways that we're able to handle that is that without going into technical details, I don't know if we'll cover this at all in this discussion. We'll cover parts of it in Eliud's discussion. But we're leveraging, these ontologies leverage what's known as description logics. This is the decidable fragment of first order logics, and probably getting a little more detail than I want here, but this is simply a computationally complete and decidable form of artificial intelligence, if we want to think of it that way. So these models can be used to detect these inconsistencies and or inaccurate data, and then initiate processes to resolve that inaccurate and inconsistent information, hence which leads to this authoritative source of truth. So another benefit to establishing this authoritative source of truth in pharmaceutical product development is the concept of timestamp data. As we talked about earlier in the inconsistent data, that data is inconsistent at an individual time collection. But when you're able to look at it over this timestamp data and tell that full story to turn it into a consistent, coherent story, it allows us to better analyze and visualize this inconsistent data. But it also has additional benefits that are discussed on the next slide. So if you'll progress there. Having a timeline of events integrated from various authoritative sources of record enable this authoritative source of truth, but it also enables the semantic platform to provide pattern analytics and discover those patterns of life of objects. So think of life of a substance or life of a patient going through clinicals, life of a process potentially. How did that process evolve over time? So these are all things that, again, having this time-stamped information allows us to get. And so Eliud's going to get into this further, but the idea of some embedded blockchain for each transaction that occurs in our authoritative systems of record to then be replayed or replayable in this authoritative source of truth, whether it's product, substance, an analysis, a patient, whatever it might be. And just imagine this idea of being able to evolve over time. At the bottom, you see this little timeline here, and be able to perform some query, some competency question like what products use what substances, a specific substance, and then be able to replay that over time to understand the maturity of this product or this substance in feeding downstream products. So this non-reputable blockchain fosters our data integrity, but it also provides that mathematical proof into the provenance, history, and legitimacy of our information really forever. And distributed consensus concerns across stakeholders, sometimes different labs within a single company, but often we're doing joint development. And so being able to foster that as well as with our regulators. And so now I'll hand the presentation off to Eliud Polanco, our Fluree president, to discuss the details of the Fluree product and delivering these capabilities that enable this authoritative source of truth to improve pharmaceutical product performance, portfolio performance. Eliud?
Eliud, you're on mute here.
All right, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. So quickly, just to kind of pick up from where Steve left off, so we talked about having an authoritative source of truth that combines some of the kind of elements of blockchain, but really just to provide elements of time and immutability of data and the ability of kind of seeing the provenance of information, how it's progressing and moving. And if we think about what are the elements that make up the Fluree platform and why we think Fluree is kind of an ideal solution to be this data science or this knowledge platform, the first thing is we do combine the elements of a knowledge graph where we can have kind of the semantic terminologies and concepts that were described in ontologies like allotrip or IDMP. But we also mix the knowledge graph with the blockchain so that we do make each point of data completely immutable, meaning the data is tamper-proof. Once the data is written in, we know exactly, we can kind of mathematically prove that the data has not been touched. And we also have a unique identifier for each piece of data so that we can see what that data is, see who's used it, track it over time. In addition to that, if we want to have a platform that enables and fosters collaboration, we also have to have the robust levels of security. We need to be able to provide control over who should be able to see what information, whether it's internal to your organization, or whether it's sharing information between yourselves and regulators, or sharing information with potential development partners or even competitors. So the idea is to kind of foster this collaboration platform, but with the ability to provide very rich security control and policies. And Fluree has a very robust policy engine that allows you to define really prescriptive and descriptive access control policies around who's allowed to see what and under what circumstances. Then the next theme is, in order to enable sharing, we have to start moving towards a model where we start reducing the number of copies that are needed to process information. As we'll talk about in a second, the way that we mostly share data is we mostly create a copy, or we open up an API, but then we basically enable the ability for people to take data from one source, copy it into another source for processing. And that just creates a little bit of the, I'll call it, complexity in the data ecosystems that we see in a lot of pharmaceutical enterprises. And so what we want to kind of position forward is a model that we call zero copy integration, right? How do you enable lots of consumers, whether they're internal to your company or external to your company? How do we give them access to data with the appropriate level of security and control that will allow them to ask the types of questions that Steve was describing, right? So if you wanted to ask questions like, what are the active substances or the active ingredients in a particular pharmaceutical product? Without having to move the data, we have ways to facilitate the ability to give people access to a lot of this information. The other thing that's really critical to this, and something that Steve talked about quite a bit, is the concept of time as a first-class citizen. Meaning we should be able to understand for every unique piece of information how every piece of data is changing over time. And we should have the ability to do true time travel, right? If you were to say, I need to be able to replicate the analysis of a result from 6 months ago, can I take a look at what the information looked like 6 months ago? We should have the ability to go back in time and replay, this is exactly what the world looked like 6 months ago, and be able to kind of reproduce a specific analysis and then use it to compare to what the results look like today. So one of the things that's really critical is the ability to be able to run algorithms, run models using lots of historical time snapshots so that you can much more easily reproduce the results from back in the past, as well as compare it to what are the specific scenarios and conditions that you're looking at in today's current time period. And then the final piece is interoperability. And there's two components to interoperability. The first is having the semantic vocabularies on top of the data so that we know what the data means. And as we'll talk about, one of the biggest barriers that we have to interoperability is that most information is created by a specific business application, and it's saved in the lexicon or the jargon of that application. And if you know that application really well, it's very easy for you to interact with the data. But if you don't know that vocabulary, if you don't understand that scheme, it's very difficult for someone to just quickly start interacting and working with the data. So having a semantic layer that allows you to have a way to kind of converse and describe the data that you're looking for in English, it's definitely going to be something that's going to help in terms of facilitating data sharing. But the other key thing is having a platform and a protocol that was designed to connect data across multiple different systems in near real time very quickly. So now instead of having to worry about creating lots and lots of different data feeds to move data from one source to the other, we can now open up and expand the platform for access to people inside your company, to regulators, to peers, to co-development partners outside of your company in a very safe and secure way. So with this background in mind, if we were to kind of take a look at what would an ideal platform, a data science platform, look like that we think could help achieve that 1 month reduction in the amount of time to go from phase 1 to phase 4. So the picture would look something like this. So let's say we have our various different processes that are required to get us all the way from phase 1 through phase 5. And let's say in drug design, we've got one or many platforms that will hold our molecular model design. And then we may have multiple different compound registration systems coming out of the result of some of the drug discovery work that we do. And then we take it to, we have one or more different LIMS systems that we use to do the assay testing and kind of run through the phase 3 and phase 4 trials. Then we may have a separate regulatory information management system that we use to actually manage all the compliance submissions, right? And then we have our ERP systems that we may be using to keep track of the manufacturing processes in the supply chain. And then we have our commercial systems where we manage pricing and we manage sales and distribution. So the idea is that across the board is going to be lots of these authoritative sources of information that contain data across what was executed, what was implemented, what metadata, what information was captured at each step of the process. And the idea what we can do is we can take this information and bring it into one collaborative shared knowledge platform that's the foundation for our data science work. And within this shared knowledge platform, we're going to represent the data from across all these systems, but we're going to represent it in a semantic layer such that you can access the information and query it using things like the IDMP ontology, or using Eliud Polanco's ontology, using ISA 88. So the goal is that for your various different use cases, rather than having to go into each of the source systems directly and having to write very complex queries, or having to write things in Python, or having to kind of do extract, transform, and load ETL data from one system to another in order to kind of run and build your analytics, that we can bring all this information into a knowledge graph. And then once it's inside the knowledge graph, it's now exposed and made available to data scientists, business analysts, product manufacturing teams, and supply chain teams. So you can cohesively take a look at the information across the board and then use this to drive some of the optimizations and some of the potential ROI that Steve was describing. Now, central to achieving this vision is being able to connect the information from multiple systems and convert this data into something that easily fits into the IDMP ontology. Now, historically, this has been extremely difficult. And there's typically been a couple of drivers that we've seen that makes transforming data and adopting a platform that allows you to interact with the data using something like the IDMP ontology particularly challenging. The first deals with the overall complexity of the data ecosystem. So the prior diagram is a somewhat simplistic view of what's really going on inside most large enterprises. And a lot of pharma enterprises, the information that was represented in that value chain could be 500 to 600 different applications or databases or operational data stores. And then that data itself may have been copied into multiple data marts, multiple data warehouses, data lakes. And so there's probably copies and copies and copies of data all over the place that's being used in order to do a lot of these analyses. And it'll be a little bit tricky in that while all these different copies of data came from multiple sources, each source system came with its own schema, its own vocabulary, its own dictionary. And depending on how mature your data governance process is, it may or may not be very easy to just take all this information and connect it to a single ontology. The other thing that we've seen is that culturally, the world of semantic ontologies and IDMP-O using the web standards that Steve was describing, so things like using the ontology web language or OWL, or using the resource definition framework or RDF. When you're using things like IDMP and you're describing the world as classes and subclasses and subjects and predicates or the relationships, it's a very different vocabulary. It's a very different paradigm compared to what most application developers and most business analysts are used to, which is data in tables, right? So you have data in rows and columns, and you may have multiple tables with different join keys, and your data is normalized or it may not be normalized. But the world of normalized data in a relational structure is very different from kind of describing the world as a graph. And so what tends to happen is, in some cases, the people that speak and understand ontologies are in one organization, and then the database administrators and the people that build and manage applications are in completely different organizations, and they're talking right past each other. So if we did want to have something that enabled you to do enterprise scale adoption of the IDMP ontology or other ontologies like allotrope, we're going to have to try to figure out how do we bridge that gap a little bit. And the net result is that it's historically been a very high risk, high cost proposition to take your data in legacy form and move it to a semantic graph form. So one of the things that we're going to talk about here is we're going to talk about how do we break through some of these potential barriers, and how do we get to a position where we can reasonably take data, apply the semantics on top of it, and get it into a knowledge shared platform such that we can start to deliver some of the optimization benefits that Steve described are possible. We're going to describe some of the challenges at a little bit lower level in 3 specific forms. I'm going to walk through how technologies and innovations today will allow us to address some of these 3 specific technical challenges in a way that will allow us to scale and deliver a knowledge shared platform in ways that may not have been viable up to 2 years ago. So we're going to talk about 3 specific techniques that we need to apply if we want to adopt IDMP at scale. The first, which we'll talk about, is called class and property classification. The second will be record level classification, and the third will be record linking. And the goal will be to work through how do we do this at this scale across all the various different hundreds of systems so that we can start to collect true knowledge in a way that's now consumable and usable by the various different analysts and data scientists downstream. So let's talk about the very first use case. And the first use case here is class and property classification. And so what we're representing here is one sample table from one database out of the hundreds of databases that may be inside an organization. And the very first question that any data scientist or any machine or algorithmic process that wants to consume data needs to answer is, what is this thing that I'm looking at? What do these columns mean? And someone like Steve can probably look at this data and intuitively understand right off the bat what this means. But it's not as easy for this to be done by machines, right? So the first thing that we have to do is we want to use IDMP as a labeling system. And what we want to do is we want to start applying proper labels. So for example, we can come back and say, look, this table is actually describing substance level information. And this column over here is actually the identifier of a moiety. And this column contains the official name of the substance. And this column contains more information about the molecular structure. So this is the SMILES value. And so the idea is to say, how do we take all of our data and how do we start to apply the appropriate labels so we can now start to correlate these 2 IDMP terms. And then because the IDMP terms themselves have very deep and rich definitions and other semantic relationships, we're now going to be able to enrich this information with a lot of context. Okay? But this is usually step 1 of the problem, which is you've got to be able to go through and somehow systematically tag our various different columns across all our different tables with the appropriate corresponding concepts and classes from IDMP. The second then challenge is going to be 1 level lower than tagging the column, but it's being able to go into individual records and start tagging and classifying certain properties about the record itself. So for example, within IDMP, there's the ISO standard 11938, which is associated to substances. And there's named individual classifier types for substances. So as Steve was describing before, you could describe a substance as a polymer. It could be a chemical, it could be a mixture. And those specific classifier types have meaning behind it. And that meaning is going to be very useful and interesting for regulatory submissions, and it's useful for kinds of discovery processes. So the question is, how would you go through and how would you apply these kinds of classifiers at an individual record level so that we can further enrich this information and convert this into proper knowledge? Some systems may have a substance type and they may be using their own vocabulary. Or in some cases, we may need to go through a process that says, I can go analyze the record, and based on the record or some properties within this record, we can go and we can infer what the appropriate substance type classifier is. Okay, so in this case, we can come back and say, okay, clearly something that has the SMILES property identified is going to be a classifier, but then you may have certain things that don't have a SMILES molecular structure because they're very diverse, or they're kind of like mixed substances. So this will be the next level down, 1 level down behind just labeling the columns in a data table. The next thing is to be able to then label using the semantic ontology, label the records themselves. And then the third thing that we're going to need to be able to address in order to do this at scale is we're going to need to be able to link and connect information almost on an automatic basis. So just to give an example, we've got our substance information in one table, and I've got another table that contains medicinal products. This could be third-party data like the MDC data, or this could be the medicinal finished products information coming from my ERP system. And so what we'd like to do is we'd like to ideally be able to connect the dots so that we can say that a substance is associated or is an active ingredient to a product. Now, it's fairly easy for people to kind of go in and on a onesie-twosie basis, go through and connect the dots, right? But it's not viable to be able to do this. I could kind of have people trying to go through and map and identify all the relationships across all the systems. So in essence, what we need to do is we need to try to find a way to take these three specific data challenges that we talked about, property level classification, record level classification, and record linking, and automate them. And if we can automate them, then this will be the vehicle or the method by which we can reasonably take information that's spread out across multiple data silos, across the value chain, and bring them together into a shared knowledge platform. Now, the good news is, if you've heard a lot about what's going on in the industry with artificial intelligence, machine learning, generative AI, diffusion models, there's been some tremendous advancements in how do we teach machines and how do we build models that can take human knowledge and can go through and help accelerate some of these processes. So one of the things that we're now introducing is Fluree is introducing a system called Fluree Sense. And Fluree Sense is a platform that allows you to run a pipeline that takes your raw data and converts it into semantic form such that we can take your raw data and load it directly into the Fluree shared knowledge platform. And what this means is that we can actually connect to your various different systems, and as part of the pipeline, run through a workflow where we go through and we say, let's go through each system and let's do the property level classification, let's do the record level classification, let's link the records across the different sources, and then let's convert everything into RDF triples. And then we will save the information or be able to kind of take it and export the data such that it can now be loaded and registered into your shared knowledge platform. And from this point forward, you now have immutable data that's been loaded into the blockchain. And now you can keep these pipelines live so that every time there's a change to any of these different systems, we can update the blockchain with that information, but maintain that semantic layer on top of the data so that you can query and describe the data using allotrip or IDMP or ISA88. Just to give a quick example of what this looks like and how it would work in Fluree Sense. So this is a screenshot of the Fluree Sense application. And here what you can do is you can import, ingest, and load multiple ontologies. So for example, in this sample client, this client has their kind of generic pharma catalog. They have IDMP. They also have the GSRS ontology. And they also have schemas and data dictionaries across some of their other applications. So let's say in this client, they're using SAP ECC as their ERP system. SAP has its own data dictionary. And so you can see that all of these different ontologies have been loaded into the system. Okay. Now within Fluree Sense, you'll see that we have IDMP already baked in. So as Steve was describing, so IDMP describes substances, medicinal products, pharmaceutical products. And then one level deep, you can kind of go in and look at all the various different subclasses and properties that are associated to pharmaceutical products. And the goal will be to say, if we can connect to your source systems, so in this case, we're going to create live connectors and we'll be able to go and plug into our compound registration system, we'll plug into our LIMS system, we'll plug into our ERP system. So we can connect to the systems across the value chain. And then once we connect to the systems, we can go through and we can start profiling individual tables or data sets from within those source systems. And what will happen is as we scan and we bring in the information, you'll see that the information is going to have been saved in the structure or the schema of the source system that created it. So in this case, we're looking at data from an ERP system. If you know the ERP system really well, then you'll understand what these columns mean. But if not, we'll have to basically apply property level classification so that we can describe this using semantic labeling in such a way that this will be more useful for end user consumption. And so one of the things that we can run with Fluree Sense is we would profile the information, and then the Fluree system can be used to do this property level classification. So in this case, we're looking at a specific attribute in that table. That attribute has a set of physical properties. So this is metadata about that specific attribute. And on the right side over here, you're seeing how the system is generating a set of predicted classifiers. And humans can go in and reinforce the classifier by giving it a thumbs up or thumbs down. And as you give it thumbs up or thumbs down, let's say you give thumbs down, you say, this is not an agent substance name, then the system will prompt and say, okay, well, if this is not a medicinal, in this case, it's saying that this is not a medicinal product hierarchy group, what do you think it is? And by doing this, we will reinforce the model and we will improve the system's ability to classify and do proper record label classification. Now, typically our experience has been that if you can properly classify 1% of your data, then you will have generated enough abstractable knowledge to go back and run through the rest of the 99% of your data assets. And that's how we will achieve the scale, by saying, have humans in the loop, do the record level classification, do the property level classification, help us define some links, do it for 1% of your data, use this to train the model. And then once the model is trained and properly set, unleash the model on your data and then let the model kind of go through and try to discover all these relationships. And when everything is said and done, the system will start to generate these graphs, right? And then what it is doing is it's starting to go through, it's starting to identify, okay, we found medicinal product information across all these different source systems, and we know how to connect the dots between the labels from the source schema and the labels or the ontological terms for the model that we're trying to map it to. And when we click on this button that says Publish Semantic Datasets, this will automatically start converting relational data that may have come in as a SQL table or could have been a file from a file system. We'll automatically go through and convert that into RDF triples. And once it's in RDF triples, we can load it into our knowledge graph. And then for the knowledge graph, we can start to ask the questions that we think are going to help drive down the time that it takes to go from phase 1 to phase 4 to try to achieve some of the product optimization opportunities that Steve was describing. So this is kind of a very fast kind of run through to describe the opportunities for how you can feasibly go through, scram all your authoritative sources, bring it into one shared knowledge platform, and then start to use it to ask the questions that are going to drive down the time to market to completing up to at least getting up through phase 4 through regulatory submissions. And what we recommend instead of next steps is we've partnered with Steve and Vitality TechNet to offer an IDMP readiness assessment. It's a time-boxed assessment that looks at your IT ecosystem, and it just measures and looks at how ready are you to start to leverage some of the machine learning and to start to leverage some of the pre-built-in connectors to go through and say, look, if we were going to do a project to start converting your data into IDMP, the readiness assessment will help you identify what's the estimated time, what's the estimated effort, and start to put a business case around what that exercise would look like. Now, we are going to be conducting a hands-on workshop in early September. It's going to be a multi-day workshop. We're actually going to go through what we just described and kind of went through at a very fast pace. We're actually going to kind of run through property level classification, record linking, record level classification, describe in a hands-on set of sessions how to use your existing knowledge and how to use AI and machine learning to help scale this across all your enterprise source systems. And then we've also offered the ability for you to sign up for our beta, where you can kind of go test this out, load your own data, run your own queries, and see what it looks like to start interacting with the Fluree knowledge platform. So you can go there to fluree.core, and there'll be a sign-in sheet where you can sign into we're in private preview right now for our cloud offering. So we hope that you found this session useful. I think the key takeaways are that the ability to just get a 4 to 6 week reduction in the amount of time that it takes to go from phase 1 to phase 4 should be able to yield in the hundreds of millions of dollars of net benefits, which will basically self-fund an activity to kind of build your knowledge platform. But in order to do that, we do have to take advantage of machine learning capabilities that can go scan introspector data at massive scale, but then convert it into something like IDMP. And then when you have the IDMP semantic on top of your data, you will have a platform that will help you automate drug discovery queries, automate the ECTD submission creation, which just create a lot of intrinsic value. So we've got about 5 minutes left. Maybe, Kevin, if there were any questions, we can kind of open up the floor for.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a super engaged audience, so thank you so much for showing up and asking your questions. I wanted to start off with a question to both Steve and Eliud. I think y'all can both answer this. The challenge that I see in achieving this IT goal in the pharma industry is that all of these systems do not talk to each other, for sure. The data depends on the users to update in real time in systems so that it can be trusted. What is our approach to resolve this issue?
Yeah, I'll take the first stab at this. So number one, the ontologies that we discussed here, that's your align your disparate terms in your various systems to industry terms. That's the first thing. And then secondly, Eliud went through how Fluree does the ingest of data, such as a relational database, uses machine learning, artificial intelligence to then say, and human in the loop to say, this is how this maps. And then subsequent ingest in near real time occurs because of that mapping. So I think that's the way it works is align the data sources to industry terms, use your AI ML automation with human in the loop, thumbs up, thumbs down to get the alignment. And then third is do automated ingest in near real time.
Excellent. Eliud, any color to add?
The only thing I'll add to that is, so because we've done this a few times, right? So let's say, like we said, Steve has kind of already done this and almost kind of like as a career, right? So we've been able to take a lot of the intellectual capital and the knowledge that Steve has, we're kind of building it into these Fluree sense models so that out of the box, we should be able to do some basic substance, pharmaceutical product, medicinal product classification. And then obviously, as we start to look at your data compared to the data that Steve historically trained into the model, then you'll be able to kind of give your thumbs up and thumbs down. Just a way to help accelerate getting the time to value of this kind of an assessment effort.
Excellent. Anthony asks a really good question. How does the ML capability resolve classification? For instance, if different people assert radically different classification recommendations?
Yeah, so the systems themselves are not psychic, right? So if we give two wildly competing answers, then the system will get confused, and the system will say, "Look, I've got equal probability that we have these different classifiers in a set of data." Now, one of the things that the system can do is the system can learn over time on how much can we trust the, let's say, kind of the reputations of the people that are giving me feedback. So if we have, for example, some users that are clearly domain experts in a certain area, but they're not strong in other areas, the system will internally develop these reputational scores, and we'll look at how much to weight individual people's feedback, so that as we start to crowdsource and get information from the broader population, we can start to weigh in how much should we kind of take people's feedback at full score, how much do we want to weight their feedback based on whatever domain and expertise that they've proven that they have specific information for. But ultimately, the goal is to kind of get this in front of as many people's hands as possible, particularly people that are analysts that are going to be using the data on a regular basis. And the more people that we feed it to, the more feedback that the system will get, the more signals, strong signals will emerge from the data, in which case you'll be able to then, by just using the data, you'll be able to see exactly what's working and what's not working.
Excellent. Michael asked a few great questions. Steve, since you're on this slide, I'll ask one that's related to this slide. He says 7.9% for a success rate is way higher than one in 5 to 10,000. Please explain the 7.9% number.
Yes, this is the not the actual success rate, it's the predicted success rate. So imagine that you're starting a new product down at phase 1 drug discovery. The idea is that you have a predicted success rate for that at 7.9%. Is the idea. So it doesn't correlate to the actual success rate.
Got it. And then Michael had another question, Eliud. When you say to track the provenance of a piece of data, do you mean a triple or some other meaning of that data?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of come to this and we'll use this as an example. So let's say that I have this specific record, and imagine that this record is a point-in-time representation of an assertion. So someone at some point in time said that for this uni, this was the substance description, and this was the SMILES value. What we would do is we would take each of those assertions as an immutable fact as of this point in time. And then what will happen is, so that means that it's almost as if each of these triples, like the triple that says that the SMILES value is associated to this specific substance, or the fact that this substance is associated to this unique identifier. So each of those triples, each of those assertions will be given a unique immutable ID in the blockchain. If anything changes, it will get its own new unique ID, and we'll be able to connect the dots and link, okay, at some point in time in the chain, this was a SMILES value. If this changes, then there'll be a different SMILES value. And we'll be able to say it's a new triple that got created. That triple has its own immutable ID. And we'll be able to then connect it and trace this thing over time so that we can actually see what this information is looking like as it's changing.
And I would add as well that in order to have the authoritative source of truth, you have got to link back to where that particular source of data, what is the authoritative system of record? Because that's typically what the scientists will trust. So without that piece of annotation that says this set of data came from this authoritative system of record, you will lose the trust or provenance of a authoritative source of truth.
We're unfortunately a few moments over. I know that there are more questions than answers. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that we will be following up and answering every single question that's been asked in the chat and the Q&A. But for now, that concludes our webinar. So a huge thank you, Steve and Eliud, for lending your time. And thank you to the attendees for joining us. The recording will be available for viewing and distribution in just a few hours. And that's about it. Thank you, Eliud. Thank you, Steve. And everyone have a great rest of your day.